my name is Elisa, and I am the Director of Marketing for GIS Planning. You can tweet out, of course, as you like if you see anything that's of interest to you, but you also will have my email address at the end to get in touch. So let's take a look at some of the things we're going to talk about in this webinar. We're going to look at, first of all, why is storytelling at all? Why is storytelling an important concept to use in place marketing or any kind of marketing? We'll look at understanding the basic narrative. We can take a look at some other options if you want to get a little fancier, but basically we're going to start with the basic components of the narrative. We're going to talk about where you go to find your stories. This is really important. I know economic developers wear many different hats and sometimes feel a little bit stressed about the idea of coming up with new marketing concepts. In fact, there are a lot of easy ways to find great content. Then we're going to talk about choosing your medium and leveraging your content in as many places as possible. We'll also look at linking to your website at the end, because it's really important, of course, that we make the most of this kind of marketing, that you're driving people back to your website with some kind of call to action. And that ultimately, of course, is the point of what we're trying to do here. So let's start about looking at why we would do storytelling at all. And it begins with this concept that the human brain is really essentially hardwired for narrative. The research is pretty compelling here. We know that, in fact, the left hemisphere of our brain organizes our memories, even our earliest memories, into stories to help us make sense of them. So our brains will impose a narrative or a story even when there is no natural or obvious or organic story there. And so we know that using stories to communicate information, of course, is very powerful. Humans have been doing that from our earliest history. It helps us make sense of the world. Even if we have to kind of work hard to put things into a kind of narrative format, our brains are still really compelled to do that. Now, the other important thing, as we were saying, that brains help us organize not just our memories, but in fact, all of the information that we assimilate from the world around us. And we know that recall is significantly improved when people can understand information in narrative format. That means that they're much more likely to remember the things that you tell them when you show them stuff in a story form. Actually, there's been a lot of really interesting research on this, whether it comes to presenting the news, the way news is written up and in newspapers and on television. Just the ways that we assimilate that information, it tends to be much more successful if we're using a story format. Now, just as a kind of reminder, when we look at the three critical components in any kind of marketing, which are really comprehension, resonance, and recall. So comprehension, of course, means that people should be able to understand what it is that you are communicating to them. We know that the story format, that beginning, middle, and end, is a very natural way for us to understand things. We want to make sure that we present the information clearly, and people tend to understand the way things move from the beginning to the end of a story. Resonance is about whether it's interesting or engaging. So, of course, we need to choose stories that would be particularly compelling to people who are interested in learning more about them. And that, of course, that's the skill that we will bring to the table as marketers and as advertisers, to make sure that what we're presenting actually has meaning to them, that it does resonate. And finally, there's that element of recall. And as I said, we know that anything presented in a story format or narrative format, people are much more likely to remember it. So that's one really great reason right there for us to consider using storytelling in our marketing. There are many natural ways to do that. Now, of course, any good story will have a point of some kind. It may be funny or sad in different kinds of ways. Hold on, let me just move this over. And it may be funny or sad, and it may have some kind of moral or lesson to teach, but we know that it helps us cut through the clutter in advertising. And that's so important, because the people we're trying to reach at any given time we're competing with so much in their lives, more than ever, in fact, as we carry our media around in our pockets with our smartphones and tablets. And so anything that helps us cut through is really quite a useful part of our marketer's toolkit. And if it resonates, if they're interested in it for some reason, they'll remember it long after the slogans and taglines and other aspects of branding are forgotten. So this really is a challenge for us to try and kind of reach out in that particular way. So let's think about, what is the basic story? Now, this is bring you back to grade school. You probably are quite clear in understanding that there's this basic linear narrative. That's the most basic story format. So what happens in a basic narrative? Well, first of all, we have the beginning. We have to explain the situation. What is, the setting? Who are the major characters? And what actually is the kind of stakes in the world of this story? Now, the middle part of the story is where we explain what the problem or the challenge and where it gets defined in some way. And of course, the end of the story is when we present the solution, when there's some kind of resolution of the situation. Now, often when I talk to marketers, they think, oh, well, that sounds so complicated. They're thinking of feature films and long novels. Of course, we don't have that amount of time as a marketer, right? We're lucky if we can hold on to someone's attention for the 2 minutes of a YouTube video or have them read, in fact, through an entire piece in our newsletters or in a blog post. Now, just because we have these three parts doesn't mean they need to be long. The challenge is to make this as compelling and pithy as possible. Let's take a look at an example. One of my favorite examples is the Greater Halifax Partnership in Nova Scotia, Canada. They do a really nice job in presenting a lot of their marketing in story format. And this is an example of it being done in print or in text, rather. So if we take a look at the basics here, first of all, even just the name, why Halifax, it kind of presents the question, the problem. They're kind of compelling. Why choose Halifax at all? But in fact, if we look at the story here, which is a piece about attracting UPS to the Halifax area, you can see that the beginning part here really just opens up, that the opening lead has to be compelling. Any business can attest to opening a location is incredibly rewarding, but always a little bit stressful. So that's certainly something that most of our readers, particularly in the business world, would be able to understand. So we began to present the kind of setting here. We're looking at Atlantic Canada. We're talking about UPS. And then we have that first quote to draw people in, because people are such an important part of any storytelling. We need to make sure that that is done very clearly as well. Then the next part is the body of the story. And you can see that in these two frames that I've presented over here. And this is where we kind of explain what the problem or the situation is and what is the solution that they're looking for. So in this case, they're talking about customers wanting delivery services. They talk about UPS considering making a move, why they looked at Halifax. And then finally, we have the resolution of the story here, where we, again, end with a quote because we really need to personalize this as much as possible. So we kind of draw it all together. Now, this is not Harry Potter, absolutely, there's no question. But in fact, these are still compelling stories. And I'll give you another example here. This is a story that is used in video format. A lot of the stories that we see, the profiles and spotlights, tend to work quite well in video format. Michigan Advantage does a good job with that. This is from one of their talent attraction microsites as well. And you can see here, I will play just a short part of this video just so that you can see what we're looking at, is a way of using people actually to tell a story. The question being, why come to Michigan? Why work in Michigan? And then this particular person's story about why they would choose that. So I'm going to play that, and hopefully you'll be able to see a little bit about what we're looking at. I'm not going to play through the whole thing, but you can, of course, I can share the link with you if you'd like to look at it.
Pure Michigan to me means home. It means where my family is. It means where I want to raise my daughter, where I want to raise my son, where I want to be. I was trying to do two things. I was trying to move across the country from North Carolina back to Michigan and also change into a different career. One of the things I loved about being a journalist was every day was different, and I'm still doing all that here now, even though I'm not a journalist anymore. I'm working in media relations, and it's a really good fit for me because I really like that what I'm doing every day is actually helping people. Beaumont is such an amazing hospital, and there's so many people who applied for this job I know who were in the area in Michigan, and the fact that they were willing to even consider a candidate from North Carolina really makes me happy, because I wouldn't be here otherwise. So I was a television reporter for about 10 years, and it was an exciting job. I got to meet all kinds of people and learn all kinds of new things. But once you have a family, it's kind of hard to have that lifestyle where if something happens with breaking news, you've got to drop everything. Looking for a job is kind of like another job in itself. I would work all day long, come home, play with my daughter for 2 or 3 hours, and she'd go to bed, and then I would stay up till midnight or 1 in the morning looking for jobs, applying for jobs, writing cover letters, changing my resume. So I reached out and talked to Jessica from Pure Michigan Talent Connect, and Jessica was willing to follow up with employers for me. So I would say, hey, I applied to this job. I think this is a great opportunity for me. And they would say, hey, I know someone over there. Let me give them a call for you. And that was just so reassuring and helpful. When you're up at night, you're like instead of applying for all these jobs and you're stressed out and you're thinking, I want to get back to my family and my daughter. I want my daughter to know her grandparents and her aunts and uncles. It was nice to know there was a person on the other end who was helping me out. When I came across Pure Michigan Talent Connect, it was great to know that I could actually build a profile for myself. I could put in my qualifications, and it would send me an automatic email and say, hey, here are jobs that would work for you that match what you're looking for. That was incredible because that took away a lot of work for me in a sense, because I knew that that job search engine was looking for me automatically every day.
Okay, I'm going to move us on from this video, but you can see quite clearly, and they have very beautiful production values here, which of course helps to make it very compelling, that we set up the initial world of the story, the character, why should we care about him? He talks about his life, and then we begin to introduce how the problem develops, and then of course ultimately what the solution is, in this case Michigan's Talent Connect, how they're able to assist him and then bring this talent into the location. Now, this is the most simple kind of story. Certainly there are other kinds of more complicated stories, a little bit harder to do in the short amount of time one usually has for marketing messages, but it is possible to do a lot nonlinear narratives, you playing around with time like flashbacks, or open-ended narratives, which you sometimes can do with series. That, of course, requires people to want to follow the series, to have followed the past ones. Some of you may recall the Nescafe commercials of a number of years back that kind of followed one across the other. People began to watch them to see what would happen with the characters. Again, a little bit harder and more complicated and not always necessary in the world of place marketing, but it does gives you an opportunity if you want to become go a little fancier. Now, often in economic development, we hear the same question: what is economic development anyway? And one of our challenges as economic developers, of course, is to explain the rather, sophisticated or complicated world of economic development to people who may not be familiar with it. And one of the nice things about stories is they help people understand what might be an abstract service. It's not as if we're selling a concrete, tangible product, a widget of some kind. And so services are something that can be very nicely explained through stories, because ultimately they're about people. And if we're looking for stories about people, we can help to connect people with that. So then the next question, of course, is where do we find all of these stories? And I would begin by asking you if you can think of the kinds of stories that we might want to tell in economic development. You can open up the question panel on the right-hand side and see if you can type in what are some of the stories that we might want to share. I know that some of you may have heard some of these stories over and over again. I showed a couple of examples here. I would have done this as a poll, of course, but we can't do an open-ended poll so easily in GoToWebinar. So, okay, so starting to get a couple of answers in there. You can put that, as I said, in the question panel on the right-hand side. So we've got success stories, absolutely. Stories about people, entrepreneurs. Yep, that's certainly something that we can do. Stories of businesses, business spotlights. Yep, absolutely. Those are some of the things we can do. Job creation, absolutely. Job creation is interesting because you might be talking about particular strategies or endeavors that are happening through your organization. Growth in residential units or some kind of housing. And that's really interesting one, actually. I'm glad you mentioned that one, because that means that we know enough about our location, that we've got the data, that we can understand what our profile is so that we can see those kinds of changes, or if any kind of significant investment, the development of a new industry cluster, for example, that's absolutely something that we might want to share. So yes, thank you all for typing those kinds of questions. Let's take a look at some of the other ones that we came up with, the many ones that you'd already mentioned. So people, entrepreneurs, success stories, business profiles, profiles in specific communities, if you have a larger location, or neighborhood profiles if you have a metropolitan area or an urban area. the thing that we want to think about, of course, is taking a look at both at large and small, so sometimes we think about the big ones, the UPSs from the Halifax example that I showed you earlier, but we also want to think about the smaller businesses, the startups in our area. We know that a significant proportion of job creation actually comes from small and medium-sized businesses in our area. We want to make sure that we encourage them as well. And one of the wonderful things about storytelling and place marketing is that it helps us really develop this wonderful rapport with our existing business community and the business people in our area. Because in profiling them, not only are we benefiting our own economic development organization and our branding, but we're helping to feature them. And that really creates a wonderful relationship with them. When done well, we're putting out their name, we're putting out their address and their web address and their contact information as well. And that tends to make them very happy. Now, one of the first ones that people suggested as the kinds of stories was a success story. But of course, there's many different kinds of success stories that you might come up with. And so it's, not like we're doing the same stories over and over again. We're thinking about some of the wonderful ways that people can be successful. There's many, many different ways to tell these stories, and there's many different kinds of stories, even within this particular format. And so we want to kind of think as creatively as possible without necessarily worrying that we're repeating ourselves all the time. One interesting idea that someone had mentioned to me that I have not yet seen, and I'd love to see it, particularly if you're trying to work on your relationships with your brokers and your commercial realtors in the area, is to do stories on particular interesting historical or unusual sites and properties in your area. Certainly something that you can consider featuring. I know some of our clients do feature a property of the day, for example, in their social media feeds, this example from downtown St. Louis. Certainly something that we encourage in the clients, our Zoom Prospect or Enterprise clients, and also our Size Up LBI clients, because you can pick specific businesses, and in this case, you can pick specific sites and properties that you can feature. And if they're interesting in particular ways, then certainly you can write up a story about them if they've got some kind of background or history, especially if they have a kind of historical angle, or if there's some kind of unusual technological angle or placement in a particular park, then that's where you can get creative with those and writing those up. The other thing you can do, of course, as someone had suggested in there, when you're talking about how something like growth in residential units could become part of our story, is to use your GIS site to really uncover the critical stories about the demographics, the workforce, or emerging industry clusters in your location. That this really is part of your story as well. And who knows this better than you do as economic developers, certainly. And so you can be using your tool as an example from our Buffalo Niagara tool, for example, excuse me, where you can pick specific properties. And in this case, you have all these reports right underneath: demographics, labor force, consumer spending, wages, business, housing, where you can, write up the story around a particular area. You can also do that, looking at clusters. If you've got, an industry cluster or a park of some kind, an industrial complex that's focused on a specific industry, where you can get the information to write up that story by using your GIS tool. And of course, if you look at, in this case, a particular community, I've got the example of Portland, Oregon, by looking at the detailed reports on your GIS site, you've got not only a ton of data and information to look at, let's say, changing population over time. Do you suddenly forecast a huge increase in the number of people between 18 and 35? Well, that's actually a really interesting story. And because the charts are fully exportable down there, you also now have something that you can use to illustrate your story. We'll talk about how images really are key. So knowing your community, being able to access that data is of course, a really important way of telling your story. And of course, visuals are so important. You want to be able to show it in charts and in graphs, but also in mapping using heat maps or layers in different kinds of ways, so that you can actually show the way these changes are happening and what actually makes a story really kind of useful. Our Size Up LBI tool, our local business intelligence tool, is a really interesting way to get profiles and information about specific businesses in your area, and also for new business people to be able to use these tools to benchmark themselves, to do some advertising for labor force and consumer spending, map out suppliers and competitors. This is a tool that gets featured typically on a Chamber of Commerce or Economic Development website to help support local businesses, many of whom won't be able to pay to access this data the way big businesses would. But of course, internally, these tools are also tremendously useful for the amount of data that they can provide to you to do the kind of marketing that you need to do to understand your location, but also to showcase it in these really beautiful visual ways. Now, as a marketer in economic development, we know that, of course, stories may not always find us. So we need to be constantly on the lookout to find the stories that we want to use. We want to be scanning the business press, staying in close contact with our chambers of commerce because they, of course, know the local business community and can help recommend, the kind of really interesting game changers or entrepreneurs or things that are happening in terms of businesses in our community. All of that really helps us color in the lines for our community. So we aren't just this kind of abstract place. We're a place with real people and businesses, interesting locations, interesting things are happening. Letting your business community know that you're interested in their successes is important. So that's really the engagement piece. And when we talk about where to put your stories, that's also recognizing that when we put out these stories, let's say on LinkedIn or on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, we're also speaking to the people who are already in our location, and they will be interested to hear these stories. It develops pride in the community, increases that rapport, as I talked about earlier, but it also may make them interested in becoming the next person or business that you choose to profile. And of course, you can use Google Alerts. I don't know how many of you are using that. Very easy, convenient, free tool. You can create as many alerts as you want to. You go to google.com/alerts. I've got a screenshot here of one that I've set up. And you see that you could put in, as often as you want. You put in your term. In this case, I put my name because that's how you want to track yourself, the name of your organization, for example. Use quotation marks so that it picks up the whole phrase. You put your email address in there and you create the alert, and it will email you every time a link appears somewhere online that has your name in it. And this is important for terms as well. So let's say you're interested in looking for economic development in Charlotte or in North Carolina or in Oregon. You can use those whole phrases and it will flag them and send you an email as often as it takes. You can usually choose a once a day digest so that you can don't have your email filled with countless alerts. And that way you can track these terms. It's a really important way to keep on top of all kinds of different things, a useful way to do that. Let's take a look at another video here that shows how storytelling can work.
My name is Wendy Achatz. My husband Dave and I own Achatz Handmade Pie Company here in Chesterfield, Michigan. We started 20 years ago making a few. We have 7 retail pie shops, and we supply about 100 grocery stores with our pies. The first few years, of course, you double in that growth. It's just exponential. But as you get bigger and you grow into the millions of dollars, it's hard to double that every year. Our goal and our vision is to get this great pie across the entire nation. So this was the first opportunity that we had to work with the MEDC. It's always great to get a phone call. Hey, there's some grant money. We want to help you. It's free. One of the big things was the GIS that they did on our 8 locations. So for many years, we went back and forth if we should close this one shop. But through the economic gardening program, they had done an actual, survey of how many people were in your area and what the per capita income was. It was great. After doing a survey, we realized that we were cannibalizing our other shops in that area, and it would be the smart thing to close one of them down. The GIS data was encouraging us to think. Let's think ahead. Let's make the decisions, with the right data. One of the specialists was a marketer, and he helped us to really focus in on what we were doing regarding marketing and how were we measuring results. And that was very important. And that really helped us to, hone in on doing the right things instead of doing a lot of different things and wondering if it worked and not having any kind of measures. He really helped us to think about it. You always question yourself, are we making the right decision? We're moving forward. Is this the right thing that we should be doing? But to have somebody there on the team that, was calling up, and we were having our weekly phone calls here through the 6-week program. It was really good to bounce off these ideas, off of an outsider to really help us. We learned a lot from from that part of the economic gardening program was to ask the right questions, know your customer, and open up a shop in the right space. It was great. It was, I was a little cautious, how much of our time would this take to get everybody up to speed of, what Ackett's Pie is doing and where we're at and, how we do business.
I'm going to stop this there because I think that gives you a pretty interesting view of the ways in which this happens. I've got one more video, but I'm going to actually skip over it so that we can take a look at some of the other things. I'm keeping an eye on the timing that we've got here. So let me move past that one. I want to talk about how we leverage our stories as much as possible. And just, I know I just skipped that video, but I'm very happy to provide many different links or examples for those of you who are interested. You'll have my email address at the end to ask me. Let's talk about leveraging stories. We know, for example, that we want to get the stories out there, but we want to make sure that they're heard. So one of the ways that I kind of suggest to get this out to as many people as possible is to begin by writing up your story in text format. And that means that even if you've produced this beautiful YouTube video or the videos that we've just seen, you can still write up a text introduction or framework for it. And that's important because Google is going to be indexing words. It doesn't index the content of video. You want to make sure that you've got those descriptive keyword terms as much as possible in a blog post, a page on your website, something that can be indexed. And then you include the YouTube video or the link as well. You want to make sure that you've got that text format. You want to put it out in your e-newsletter. You want to post it across your social feeds as much as possible. Encourage anyone that you are profiling or focusing on to post it on their feeds as well. It's really about that snowball effect as much as possible. And then regularly repost because, I think a tweet has a half-life of 18 minutes. You want to make sure that you get things out there periodically, even if it's a couple weeks or a couple months later. This is great content. And unless it really is clearly outdated because something has changed, there's no reason you shouldn't continue to get use out of it. Keep your content short and punchy. So you saw the Halifax UPS story was quite short, just a one-page thing. You could even make it shorter than that if you wanted to. Videos, even a 2-minute video is pushing it. I would try, I know some are as long as 3 or 4 minutes. People tend to have a very short attention span online, so I really do encourage you to keep your videos anywhere from 30 seconds up to 2 minutes probably is fine. You want to always write up SEO-friendly text description with your video. Again, video is not indexed by Google. The text will be. And of course, include the URLs of any businesses that you're talking about because you want to give them that extra bump in traffic potentially. Make sure that you increase that, work on that rapport. So here's an example at the bottom of this YouTube video about a bike-friendly business in Oregon. You can see at the bottom that there is a little bit of text there. You could certainly go longer on the text if you wanted to, that explains some of these kinds of things, and that is what Google is going to be looking at, really useful. Then you want to put it out across as many different social media platforms as possible. Here's an example of storytelling being posted on the Michigan Economic Development Corporation Facebook page. You can see this there. Greater Halifax Partnership actually has podcasts put out on iTunes. I thought that was quite interesting. I certainly hadn't come across a lot of that, so that's quite useful. So these would be just audio versions of interviews or profiles. There's another example from Halifax of a story about the wine industry, and you can see just how many people liked it, which means that all of their LinkedIn contacts would then also see the story. It's that snowball impact as much as possible. Another example of storytelling about a diner owner, also getting really nice kind of metrics on LinkedIn, lots of people liking and sharing. Here's an example of someone posting a YouTube story on the Pinellas County Economic Development LinkedIn page. So again, it's about taking the same content and leveraging it across as many places as possible. That is really the idea. Here's also another novel one is the Pinterest page, Maryland Department of Business and Economic Development. Some of these things are stories of their own, and some of them are interesting articles or links that they are repinning on this particular bulletin board about businesses in the Maryland area. Again, each one of these things serving to drive traffic. This isn't an economic development agency. This is a location advisor, but they're using Instagram and different kinds of hashtags also to tell something about a particular company, in this case, a powder coating factory. You can look on Twitter for examples of ways in which Metro Denver EDC and many others are again telling the same stories, that maybe a blog post or a YouTube video or a news item, but then making sure that it gets told across these different places as well. Now, finally, we want to make sure that we're linking it to your website, because all of these stories ultimately have one goal, right? Which is to drive qualified prospects your way. On every story, in every format, you need to consider your CTA, your call to action. Do you want to have a link that they will be able to click back to learn more? Are they going to have an email address or a telephone number? Do you want them to register for a webinar or a seminar? Often this is a live link to your website, but there's many different ways to do that. In this case, an example from one of our clients, South Central Kentucky, they have on their page here not just static content, but also this kind of searchable place where people can begin using, in our intelligence component on the right-hand side, can begin search, our widget rather on the left-hand side, can begin searching for buildings, sites, communities right there. And so driving them to a website that they can then use in an interactive way for looking for additional information is so important when we're talking about qualified leads and ways in which we can send them that way. Now, other things you want to think about in your stories is that you've got SEO optimized keywords for your location, as we were saying. You want to make sure that you have clear email or contact information for key people, if that's part of what you want, is that to initiate contact. Webinar, conference, seminar registrations, there's lots of different ways you could have a call to action, but you must be very clear what you want your story to do. General marketing and branding is important, but on its own, it isn't enough. It's not going to give you enough bang for your buck. We were talking about sending people to a LinkedIn profile page, for example. This is for Empire Development in New York State, that you have all this information right there. If you wanted to use that as a place to post information, that could be quite useful. So what are some of the key takeaways that we had here? We talked about using storytelling to engage, explain, and encourage recall. We talked about focusing on the people, businesses, and data in your location. We talked about leveraging content across as many media platforms as possible so that you really make the most of the time that you've invested in putting those stories together. You want to link back to your website and have a clear call to action. And you really want to think creatively as much as possible. How can you cut through the clutter? What are some of the different ways that you can tell a story in compelling and interesting ways? Even if you don't have big budgets for fancy video production, there's all sorts of interesting ways that you can be doing that with images, with text, with just really good quality writing. That's certainly possible as well. Now, I'm happy to take any questions that people might have at this point. You're also welcome to get in touch with me at any time. My email address is up here on the screen. You are invited to follow GIS Planning on LinkedIn. Our LinkedIn URL is right over there. Please come and find us there. We've often got interesting tips and blog posts. I'll always have the video link to our recorded webinars, and slide shares get posted up there as well. And of course, you're welcome to follow us on Twitter and let us know what you thought of today's webinar. If you do have any questions, you can put that in the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. I'd be happy to answer those. And as I said at the very beginning of the webinar, I'm very happy to send out the link to the recording of this webinar. You'll receive that in the next couple of days. And we will post it, of course, on our blog page and our LinkedIn page as well, so you can take a look at it over there. So I have one question about budgets. Someone says they're from a small EDC and they are doing marketing on top of all of their other duties, and they're concerned about how they can manage to tell stories effectively with, it sounds like, no budget at all. And of course, you really can. I mean, you won't be able to necessarily do the fancy video productions that we might see, but even just a simple video handheld, you can have high definition video on a smartphone or a tablet these days. It's not too difficult to do short video profiles, 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, just asking some interesting questions of the people from your location, and they will definitely be able to put something up there. People love to see themselves online, and we see all different kinds of production values out there. As long as you can clearly see and hear people, I think that's useful. Then, of course, writing things up in text format is absolutely legitimate. It doesn't require the same kind of budget that the other ones do, just a little bit of time. Use your GIS tool, use the information that you have at your disposal, and start just doing outreach in your community to sit people down over the phone, ask them a few questions, and you can usually write up a great short profile of the kinds of things that they're doing, and that would be enough to make very happy. Another question that I have here, is it best practice to get permission from the company before you tell a story? Is that always necessary? That's an excellent question. I would say that it is best practice to do that for two reasons. One, because it accomplishes not only getting you the content that you need by having access to them. You want to have quotes from people. You want to be able to interview them, even if it's just for a few minutes over the telephone. That's what helps personalize a business, because it's really the people in the business that are so interesting, but also because it helps you create a good relationship with the businesses in your area by letting them know not only are you trying to attract new investment, but you're also trying to support local businesses by giving them time. I would also be careful, although it's not considered journalistic best practices to share material with someone that you're profiling. In this case, I think it's probably a good idea to show them a draft copy of what it is you're going to be putting out there, just in case there's anything that they find either incorrect or possibly of concern to them. So you make sure you get a chance to correct that. I don't think you'd want to really surprise anyone with a profile on their business without giving them a chance to have some kind of intervention. And then I had a question about getting a copy of the PowerPoint to show the marketing committee. I don't actually use PowerPoint, but I am using Prezi, and I'm very happy to share the link so you can show this if you don't want to show a video copy of the webinar. I think that brings us to the end of our time here today. Feel free, as I said, to reach out via email. I'm always happy to answer questions. And